Hi, this is Jonathon Palmieri with the University of Hartford's Managing Organizational Process Summer Class of 2023. We're going to be going through a case study of recruitment capacity. Our objective is using data from the client organization to outline key concepts of capacity. The data used in this case is real, but has been proportionally changed to keep the client anonymous. On our agenda, we're going to be describing the client, defining key capacity terms, highlight the importance of capacity planning, provide the base case of the client recruitment capacity, explore candidate sourcing capacity, explore interview capacity, and define cash flow impact of capacity. So the client is a commercial life science consulting firm with an operational footprint in 75 plus countries, with around 3,500 employees, offering products and services in data engineering and data science consulting and cloud software. In this case study, we're going to cover some key concepts, including capacity, capacity cushion, gap, requirement, base case, cash flow, diseconomies of scale, economies of scale, planning horizon, setup time, and utilization. Some of the key terms we need to understand are capacity, which is the maximum rate of output of a process or a system, the capacity requirement, which is what a process capacity should be for a time period to meet the demand of external and internal customers, given the firm's desired capacity cushion, the capacity gap, which is the positive or negative difference between the projected demand and the current capacity, and the capacity cushion, which is the amount of reserved capacity a process uses to handle sudden increases in demand or temporary losses of production capacity. Within a recruitment concept, this is forecasting hiring, planning hiring resources, meeting business growth objectives, budgeting and recruitment ROI, process planning and analysis, and internal credibility. To measure recruitment capacity, we generally concentrate on candidate sourcing and candidate interviewing as the two main functions of a recruiter. Candidate sourcing is the process to source a candidate for an open requisition, and candidate interviewing is the process of evaluating a candidate as a potential hire to fill an open requisition. When we're describing the client company, we're going to be talking about the base case, which is the act of doing nothing and losing orders from any demand that exceeds current capacity or incur costs because capacity is too large. Essentially, this is where the client company is at now. From a recruiting perspective, that's their current recruitment process and the number of positions filled without any strategic changes. So to understand that, we have to first understand what the client recruiting process is. So from job intake to hiring and onboarding, the client company is going to go through several processes in order to get a candidate from not knowing the organization to being an employee of the organization, with several candidates along the way being lost throughout the process for either choosing not to continue in the process or being deselected out of the process. As candidates go through the process, recruiters and leaders are going to track several metrics, including the cost per hire, vacancy cost, sourcing costs, time to fill, and time to hire. Given that this isn't a class on metrics, we're not going to talk about these too much in depth, and instead we're going to talk about the basis of them. So sourcing is the cost, the amount of money it takes to get a candidate into the process. Then we have time to fill, which is the amount of time it takes from a job opening to an employee starting. And then we have the cost per hire and vacancy cost, which is the amount of money that's spent from the time of a candidate or a job opening and a candidate going through the process to an employee starting. Jumping in on capacity from a candidate sourcing perspective, we're going to look at the current process from how a candidate comes into the system, from inbound marketing, specifically from Jazz HR, which is the client's applicant tracking system, and then the outbound marketing, which is the tools used by a recruiter to get candidates into the process. Given that the outbound marketing is more directly related to the recruiter's efforts, we're going to concentrate on those two tools, LinkedIn and Dice, as our main resources for recruitment capacity and their effectiveness of each platform and the effort of a recruiter. So when looking at these two platforms, we want to look at the amount of profiles views, the in-mails or outreach being sent, the submissions to a hiring manager, which is where a recruiter basically takes the profile of a candidate and their notes and sends it over to the hiring team to make a decision on moving them forward in the hiring process, the amount of offers we make, and the number of hires. To reverse engineer this, though, we're going to take those numbers and we're going to revert them to one hire for the amount of effort that it takes from profile views to submissions. And we're going to find, using the math of time that it takes for each task, we're going to find that it takes about 84 hours to source enough candidates to make one hire. So if our organization has a goal of 12 hires a year per recruiter, then our capacity requirement in hours of sourcing per year is 1,008 if only using LinkedIn. From a DICE perspective, it takes about 90 hours of sourcing per hire, which means for a goal of 12 hires per year per recruiter, our capacity requirement is going to be 1,080 hours. This information can be used to evaluate the effectiveness of each platform. If the cost per outreach was the same, LinkedIn would be a better choice. However, there are other constraints to be considered when looking at the different platforms. To identify these constraints, we can look at the effectiveness of each platform and each step of the process of sourcing a candidate. So from total profile viewed to emails, we can look at the percentage of candidates that make it to the next step. And we continue doing this through each step so that we can understand the effectiveness of the process through the utilization, which is the degree to which the equipment, space, or the workforce is currently being used and is measured as the ratio of average output rate to maximum capacity expressed as a percentage. Now, looking at this, most people would say, why not scale it out if we know exactly how many candidates to be reached to how many hires? Why not take a volume approach and reach out to a ton of different candidates? Well, the reason why is that there are capacity limits to each platform, as well as supply and demand of labor forces that limits the ability to just reach out to an unlimited number of candidates. There's also other constraints such as platform limitations, bottlenecks, candidate mix decisions. So from platform limitation, this is from a theory of constraints, which suggests that there's performance limits to any process. For example, LinkedIn limits based on in-mail response rates, the number of in-mails that can be sent in a certain period of time. There's also a limited number of candidates on any platform for a specific role that fit the criteria of the search function. Bottlenecks refers to the stage or resource that limits the overall system's output or throughput. Screening candidate profiles, taking too long, and absorbing too much capacity of a recruiter for the hiring return is an example of a bottleneck. And then there's product mix decision, which in this case is a candidate mix decision, which is making decisions on which candidate to focus based on the bottleneck capacities and ensuring the optimal results. As I said, that's spending additional time screening profiles to try and increase the ratio of candidates being selected to interview may not be the best way to get the maximum output. To counteract these constraints, we can counteract platform limitations by using multiple platforms and spacing outreach to allow for response times so that we aren't limited by those platforms. For bottlenecks, we can use technology and automation to streamline candidate screening through tools like screening forms. And from a candidate mix decision, we can use tools like a job intake form to clarify and evaluate criteria. Another example of automation and technology that we can use to decrease bottlenecks and improve efficiency would be what we see on the far right here, which is a tool that uses regular expression searching to highlight keywords and speed up the process for a recruiter to be able to identify criteria of a candidate as they compare to the requirements of a job opening. Next, we're going to talk about the capacity of interviewing. For this, time to hire is going to be one of the big pieces here. Interviewing capacity cushion is essentially the time that we're looking at for each individual task as a standard of work. So for interview capacity, pre-offer capacity cushion, and offer capacity cushion, we're essentially going to take those times that it takes, and we're going to come up with what the standard amount of time is. To understand, what to do with that, we're going to look at the base case, which would be to look at the 148 days of time to fill and the 66 days for time to hire of the current process. We can use this for planning for quarterly, weekly, and daily activity goals, as well as identifying different steps of the process that may be causing problems. So from this, we know that the capacity cushion compared to the time to hire for the team average comes out with a target of 30 days, but an actual of 66 days. So we know that the gap is 36 days. So when the capacity is lower than the capacity requirements, the time to hire might increase because a recruitment team or interviewers can't process candidates quickly enough. However, there may be other constraints as well as process limitations. An example of that would be candidates are slow or non-responsive to interview scheduling, or interviews have scheduling conflicts, so the interviewers are unavailable. There's bottlenecks in the stage, including requesting or coordinating candidate scheduling can create a bottleneck when I go to a coordinator or a scheduler, and that process in itself takes time, longer than it would for me to reach somebody. Or if they are overloaded in capacity themselves, then it can create a bottleneck. And then the candidate makes a decision. An example of that would be an interview panel can only interview 2 candidates without making a negative impact to their own work. And therefore they have to choose 2 of so many candidates, 4 candidates to interview within that week, with the possibility of losing candidates because they didn't get to them quickly enough and another firm picked them up. To counteract some of these constraints, we can have alternative interviewers. We can use interview feedback forms to create consistent feedback and communication between candidates, which helps with evaluation. And we use technology and tools like interview scheduling tools like Calendly to be able to automate and improve the process of scheduling with candidates, as well as constant contact and setting expectation with candidates so they know what is expected of them when scheduling. So all this information is really useful because it helps us figure out the cash flow and impact of the efforts. So for example, for a vacancy for a principal consultant who may bring in $600,000 in profit or revenue a year, which is $2,307 a day, we know that for the average time to fill of 148 days, we're losing about $341,000 in revenue. That 36-day gap alone is $83,000 just lost in revenue. So improving or decreasing that gap can save us a ton of money, as well as create a better candidate experience, which again is outside of the scope of that. So that cash flow from a sourcing cost perspective is essentially looking at the amount of time and money spent on the efforts to source a candidate. We can see that essentially equates to $20,000 in money spent to source one hire. When we add that to our vacancies lost revenue, we are essentially coming up with a vacancy cost of $362,341 per vacancy of a principal consultant, which is a ton of money. So pulling it all together, we're going to look at capacity management from a sourcing capacity to use it to hit our hiring goals, to optimize and analyze resources, including recruiters, sourcers, and our sourcing tools. We're going to look at our interview capacity to optimize our process, calculate cash flow using sourcing costs, cost per hire, vacancy costs, and time to fill. And we're going to take those 2 together, and we're going to look at our recruitment capacity planning for budget and resource of talent acquisition efforts, and to create growth, replacement, and succession hiring timelines. We can use this information to optimize our efforts and ROI. We can use this to know how long we should be starting our recruitment efforts before we actually need someone to start on a project, or likewise. And that basically wraps up the capacity within the recruitment perspective. If you have any questions, feel free to email me and ask me further. And thank you.